There was a time when pickup trucks were built like brute tools, tough, simple, and sometimes dangerously untested. A few of them pushed the limits so far the government stepped in, lawsuits exploded, and automakers quietly wished they could erase them forever. Some were unstable, some were fire hazards, and others broke rules so badly they were pulled from the roads entirely. These are the old banned pickups you won't believe were ever real. The Ford Bronco II, sold from 1984 to 1990, occupies a dark and uncomfortable place in automotive history. Not because it was slow, ugly, or unreliable, but because its basic proportions and engineering created a vehicle that seemed almost designed to betray its drivers at the worst possible moment. On the showroom floor, the Bronco II looked like exactly what American buyers wanted in the mid-1980s. It was compact, rugged, shaped like a scaled-down off-road truck, and promised real SUV capability without the size and cost of a full-size Bronco. Built on the Ford Ranger platform, it seemed like the perfect compromise, light enough for commuters, tough enough for weekend adventure, practical enough for families. Dealers sold it as a vehicle that could do everything: tow, haul, commute, explore, while still fitting neatly in the garage. But underneath the marketing, the Bronco II carried a design problem that would haunt it forever. The vehicle sat high and narrow, with much of its weight perched above the frame. That combination created an unusually high center of gravity relative to its track width. In normal, gentle driving, it felt fine, even pleasant, thanks to the soft suspension. But when something unexpected happened, a sudden swerve, an emergency lane change, a correction on the highway, or even a quick turn taken just a little too fast, the Bronco II behaved differently from what most drivers expected. Instead of leaning and recovering, it could snap. In many incidents reported across North America and beyond, the rear lifted, the body shifted violently, and the SUV tipped, sometimes rolling once, sometimes multiple times. Drivers had almost no warning and very little chance to correct. What made things worse was that most owners weren't reckless thrill seekers. Many were ordinary families, commuters, and cautious drivers who simply reacted instinctively to unexpected situations: an animal in the road, debris, a drifting car beside them, and found themselves upside down in seconds. As reports accumulated, patterns became impossible to ignore. Insurance companies flagged the Bronco II. Highway patrol officers noticed that rollovers involving the model were disproportionately severe. Internal and external investigations linked the design geometry directly to instability. Lawsuits mounted, testimony accumulated, and engineers dissected what had gone wrong. The stories were remarkably similar. A quick correction, a lane change, a curve taken slightly too fast, and then chaos. Over the years, dozens upon dozens of rollover fatalities were documented in the United States alone, with far more injuries tied to ejections, roof collapses, and violent tumbling crashes. News organizations investigated, safety advocates pushed regulators, lawyers confronted Ford, families demanded answers. Governments and regulatory bodies began responding in different ways. Some regions issued warnings about rollover risk. Others placed restrictions or imposed testing requirements that made the Bronco II far harder to certify. Fleet purchasers backed away. Certain countries hesitated to approve imports at all, and in places where it technically remained legal, liability concerns made dealers reluctant to continue promoting it. The Bronco II was never always dramatically banned in headline-grabbing fashion, but in practice it became a vehicle that regulators, insurers, and governments increasingly wanted off their roads. Quietly, approvals dried up, sales dropped, its reputation darkened. By the late 1980s, the Bronco II had become a symbol, a cautionary emblem of what happens when marketing ambition collides with marginal stability. It was effectively replaced by the Ford Explorer, which itself would later become part of another major safety controversy. But in the Bronco II's case, the message was already clear. Geometry matters, and physics cannot be negotiated with brochures and slogans. Looking back, the Bronco II's legacy is grim and complicated. On one hand, enthusiasts still admire its compact size, simplicity, and old-school SUV charm. Off-road hobbyists sometimes appreciate its light weight and short wheelbase. Collectors value it as a relic from a formative period in SUV history. But that nostalgia is tempered by harsh reality. The Bronco II helped fuel new scrutiny of rollover risk, vehicle stability standards, tire selection, suspension tuning, and the way manufacturers evaluate emergency handling behavior. It demonstrated brutally and repeatedly that a mass-market vehicle must be designed for imperfect drivers in imperfect situations, not just idealized test scenarios. In the end, the Bronco II's fate wasn't sealed by lack of power, bad styling, or poor sales. It was sealed by fear, lawsuits, injuries, and physics. Its reputation for rolling over didn't merely stick, it defined the vehicle. And in many places, it became banned in practice, quietly removed from approval lists, sidelined by regulators, shunned by insurers, and overshadowed by safer successors. If you'd like, I can go even deeper, including real court cases, engineering memos, crash statistics, how Ford responded internally, and where specifically the Bronco II faced restrictions. The Chevrolet and GMC CK pickups built from 1973 through 1987 are, in many ways, the definition of the classic American work truck: square, simple, rugged, and seemingly indestructible. Farmers used them, contractors lived in them, families drove them for decades. They hauled lumber, boats, trailers, livestock, and everything in between. To millions of owners, these trucks represented reliability and strength. But buried deep within that tough, everyday image was a design decision that would haunt General Motors for years, a decision that sat quietly under the bed of the truck, bolted just outside the frame rails. It was the side saddle fuel tank system. Instead of placing the fuel tank inside the frame, protected by steel structure like most trucks eventually would, GM mounted the tanks on the outer side of the frame rails, directly behind thin sheet metal. It made packaging easier. It increased fuel capacity without shrinking cargo space. It was cheap to produce. On paper, it worked. In real life, it could become deadly. In a side-impact collision, the exact kind of crash pickups often experience at intersections, on rural roads, or when struck by larger vehicles, the exposed fuel tank could be crushed, punctured, or torn open. The metal seams could split. The sending unit could be ripped out. All at once, gasoline sprayed out under pressure. A spark from crushed metal, a broken battery cable, or friction from the collision itself could ignite the fuel instantly. And then a survivable side collision turned into a wall of fire. Over time, investigators, journalists, and safety experts began to notice patterns. Fire departments documented crashes where victims survived the initial impact, only to be trapped in a burning truck seconds later. Lawsuits emerged claiming the design was inherently dangerous. Former engineers testified that alternatives had been proposed, safer locations, protective shielding, but were deemed too costly or unnecessary. What made things worse was that these weren't exotic high-speed crashes. Some happened in parking lots. Others occurred at modest rural road speeds. A hard strike to the side, especially from another truck or SUV, could rupture the tank like a soda can. Public awareness exploded when televised investigations and court cases dug into the design. The phrase side saddle tanks became synonymous with danger. Critics accused GM of putting cost savings ahead of safety. GM, in turn, defended the trucks, arguing that they met the standards of their time, but the courtroom battles did not stop. Eventually, under pressure from lawsuits, settlements, and government scrutiny, GM agreed to programs aimed at retrofitting, reinforcing, or otherwise addressing the risk on hundreds of thousands of trucks. Meanwhile, the real-world fallout spread. Certain fleets, especially those involving hazardous jobs, industrial sites, or government work, began quietly refusing or removing side-saddle CK trucks. Job site policies were written that prohibited their use. Insurance companies flagged them. Fire marshals in some jurisdictions issued warnings. The trucks were not always formally banned with dramatic headlines, but in practice, doors closed around them. If a truck was likely to be struck, operate among heavy machinery, or risk side contact, supervisors simply did not want that fuel system anywhere near their workers. And the owners who continued driving them? Many did so with a strange combination of love and unease. They appreciated the durability, engines that ran forever, frames that towed anything, but more than a few people admitted that every time a car drifted toward their door in traffic, they thought about the tanks sitting right behind thin metal. The side saddle controversy altered the way automakers thought about fuel system safety. Designers shifted tanks inward, shielding became thicker. Crash testing began simulating more severe, realistic side impacts. Regulators learned hard lessons about how slow standards can be and how long an unsafe idea can linger when it is cheap and profitable. Yet the cultural contradiction remains striking. These trucks are icons, beloved, collectible, beautiful in their boxy simplicity. They starred in movies, worked on farms, and became family heirlooms, but at the same time, they represent one of the clearest examples of how a single engineering shortcut can turn a workhorse into a risk. The Chevrolet GMC CK side saddle era stands today as a reminder that toughness is not always protection, and that what looks strong from the outside might hide a vulnerability that only reveals itself in the worst possible moment, when it is already too late. If you want, I can go even deeper. Court details, retrofit programs, known accident statistics, internal engineering debates, and specific examples of regions and fleets that refuse these trucks, and turn this into an even larger documentary-style narrative.
The Datsun 620, or Nissan 620, is one of those vehicles that look innocent when parked, almost like a friendly little work companion. But when you dig into its story, you begin to see why, in several parts of the world, authorities eventually treated it with suspicion, and in some cases, effectively kept it off fast highways. To understand why the 620 became so controversial, you have to imagine the world of the early 1970s. Fuel prices were rising, American trucks were huge and thirsty, and many countries were desperate for economical, compact utility vehicles. Nissan saw an opportunity. The 620 promised everything ordinary buyers wanted: small size, low cost, excellent fuel economy, rugged leaf spring simplicity, and the reputation Japanese engineering was quickly earning for durability. And in many ways, it delivered. Mechanics loved working on them. Farmers adored them for light chores. Students and young families liked that they could move furniture, haul lumber, or commute without spending a fortune. At low speeds on smaller roads, the truck felt manageable and even fun. But the truck carried an engineering compromise that simply did not scale to the faster, wider highways that were appearing in many countries. The heart of the problem was balance. The short wheelbase meant the distance between the front and rear axles was small, which made steering very responsive. Combine that with a narrow track width and a tall stance, and you have a vehicle where weight shifts dramatically side to side under sudden movements. Leaf springs at the rear, designed mostly for carrying loads, could allow the truck to hop over bumps instead of absorbing them smoothly. Light weight meant there wasn't enough mass to settle the chassis when things started going wrong. Now imagine this scenario, and it happened countless times. A driver is cruising at 95 kilometers per hour on an open highway. There's a crosswind. Maybe there's a light load in the bed, unevenly distributed.
Another car cuts into the lane. The driver turns slightly to avoid it, then corrects back. For many cars, nothing dramatic would happen. In a Datsun 620, the rear end might suddenly step sideways. Not violently at first, just a small wag, almost like the tail of a nervous dog. The driver instinctively corrects, but the wheelbase is short and steering is sensitive, so the correction is slightly too much. Now the wagon effect increases. The truck swings the other way. The rear axle begins to oscillate. Tires scrub. Grip returns suddenly, and the whole truck shifts its weight onto one side. In that instant, everything can go wrong. Some trucks spun, others rolled, and many drivers described the same terrifying sensation afterward. It didn't warn me, it just went. Road agencies started noticing patterns. Lane change tests showed instability. Emergency maneuver tests produced unpredictable behavior. Reports of fishtailing and rollovers appeared far more often than regulators were comfortable with. So, without always using the word ban, authorities reacted. In some countries, highway licensing for certain configurations was limited. Others required lower speed limits for light pickups of this type. Some governments refused to register imported units for unrestricted expressway travel. Fleets increasingly avoided them. Insurance warnings appeared in certain markets. The truck hadn't become illegal everywhere, but it became unwelcome in many places where roads were fast and traffic aggressive. Owners themselves often talked about the 620 in almost superstitious tones. One farmer might say, "It's perfect around town, but don't let your kid take it on the highway." Another driver recalled loading brakes in the bed to just give the rear axle more stability. Some added sandbags permanently. Others installed aftermarket sway bars, extra shocks, or stiffer springs just to make the truck feel less nervous at speed. And there were plenty who simply said, "Drive it like the 1970s, not like the 2000s." What makes the story haunting is that the truck was not maliciously designed. It simply represented a world that was changing faster than engineers expected. Roads got faster, expectations for safety became stricter, and a charming, lightweight utility pickup suddenly looked like a relic from a slower, simpler era. Today, enthusiasts see the Datsun 620 as a symbol of both nostalgia and warning. It is admired for its honesty, simplicity, and longevity, but it also reminds us that physics does not forgive. Lightweight trucks with narrow stance and short wheelbase demand respect, and they punished anyone who forgot that fact. In the end, the 620 was not just unstable, it was a truck designed for another time, pushed into a future it wasn't built to survive. And regulators eventually stepped in to protect drivers from learning that lesson the hard way. If you want, I can make it even longer, adding specific accidents, market reactions country by country, comparisons with other unstable pickups, or more owner quotes. Just tell me.
The Toyota Hilux diesel of the early 1980s is often remembered today as a symbol of rugged reliability, a workhorse capable of surviving environments that would cripple lesser trucks. Its reputation for toughness was well earned over decades, but the early diesel variants carried a hidden danger that many drivers and regulators discovered the hard way. At first glance, the truck seemed perfect. Small enough to maneuver easily, economical for daily work, simple to repair, and with the legendary Toyota reliability that had already started to win trust worldwide. Mechanics appreciated the straightforward engine layout, fleet operators loved the low fuel consumption, and rural families and businesses adopted them in large numbers for hauling, commuting, and light industrial use. On gravel roads, farms, or in city traffic, the Hilux felt dependable, almost invincible. It could carry heavy loads, tow modest trailers, and endure punishment without complaint. But the combination of early diesel technology, high load demands, and a nascent understanding of turbocharged mechanical fuel injection systems created a latent risk that would emerge in the most dangerous situations. The core of the problem was the mechanical injection pump that fed diesel into the engine. Under normal circumstances, it performed well, delivering steady power and impressive torque.
However, when the truck was pushed to its limits, heavy cargo, steep inclines, long highway stretches, or high ambient temperatures, the pump could fail suddenly and catastrophically. This failure was immediate. There was no sputtering, no hesitation, no early warning. One moment, the driver was climbing a hill at full throttle. The next, the engine simply died, cutting off all power. With diesel engines, the moment the engine stops, systems that rely on engine-driven assistance also falter. Power steering resistance increased sharply, braking assistance dropped, and the hydraulic brakes felt heavier, requiring far more effort from the driver to slow the vehicle. A truck that had felt manageable seconds before became a heavy, unwieldy object rolling under its own momentum, with the driver in a struggle against physics rather than simply controlling a machine. The danger was amplified by the circumstances in which Hilux diesels were often used. Many trucks operated in remote regions, on mountainous roads, or carrying maximum legal loads. Some served in industrial or commercial settings where steep grades and long descents were unavoidable. The sudden loss of engine power in these environments was not a minor inconvenience. It could quickly escalate into an accident with severe consequences. Investigators reviewing crash reports noted a distinct pattern. Accidents occurring during high-load, high-speed operations, often on inclines, with limited skid marks indicating that the driver had very little time to react. Victims' accounts frequently described the terrifying instant when the engine stopped and the truck felt as though it had grown heavier and more resistant to steering, as if the momentum had taken over and the driver had been rendered almost powerless. Insurance companies began to notice unusual claim patterns associated with these trucks. Repeated minor and major accidents on highways prompted internal reviews, and fleet operators started documenting mechanical failures that coincided with sudden loss of control. Correspondence with Toyota technical support revealed growing concern about the injection pump design. Field mechanics shared stories of repeated catastrophic pump failures, sometimes even on brand new trucks that had been lightly loaded but operated in high ambient temperatures. Retrofits and repairs were attempted, including reinforcing lubrication systems, adjusting tolerances, and replacing pumps with updated versions where available, but the underlying risk remained until a full redesign was implemented. Regulatory responses varied by country. In several markets, authorities refused certification for the early diesel models until Toyota introduced stronger injection pumps and revised turbocharging systems. Some governments issued temporary bans on new registrations or restricted use to lower-speed roads, effectively keeping these vehicles off expressways and highways. Safety bulletins warned drivers about the risk of sudden power loss, instructing them to avoid overloading and to exercise extreme caution on steep grades. Fleet operators, particularly those responsible for transporting passengers or hazardous materials, began replacing these early diesels with gasoline models, or later, fully upgraded diesel versions. In practice, while the trucks were not universally banned, they were effectively restricted in high-risk scenarios, leaving many owners wary of using them as they were originally intended. Drivers and owners developed a cautious respect for the trucks. Many installed auxiliary braking systems or carried tools and spare components to mitigate the risk of sudden engine failure. Others modified their driving habits, keeping speeds lower, avoiding steep declines, and never pushing the truck to full load on extended highway stretches. Forums and personal accounts describe the anxiety that accompanied long trips, a silent awareness that the engine could fail instantly, and that a truck that had been controllable minutes ago could become a runaway force. Some owners even resorted to adding ballast to the cargo bed to improve stability, or using aftermarket devices to maintain some level of braking assistance during a sudden engine shutdown. Toyota responded to the crisis with engineering revisions. Injection pumps were strengthened, turbocharging systems were recalibrated, and lubrication pathways were redesigned to ensure continuous operation under load. These changes eliminated the worst failures and restored confidence in the Hilux brand, paving the way for its enduring reputation as one of the most reliable trucks in history. Nevertheless, the early diesel models remain a cautionary tale, a reminder that even machines famed for toughness can hide vulnerabilities that only become apparent under real-world stress. The lessons learned influenced not only Toyota's engineering practices, but also broader regulatory standards for highway safety, component testing, and mechanical reliability. Ultimately, the early 1980s diesel Hilux illustrates the delicate balance between engineering ambition, practical use, and safety oversight. A vehicle can be durable, well-built, and globally successful, yet one overlooked weakness, in this case a mechanical injection pump prone to sudden failure, can transform a symbol of reliability into a vehicle of hidden danger. For those who owned and operated these early diesels, the lesson was unforgettable. Vigilance, respect for mechanical limits, and awareness of latent flaws were as crucial as the truck's famed endurance. Today, collectors and enthusiasts admire these models for their historical significance and simplicity, but every story carries the echo of sudden, uncontrollable power loss, reminding the world that even the toughest machines are only as safe as their weakest components.
The Mitsubishi Forte, later known in many markets as the Colt pickup, was a small utilitarian truck that epitomized the 1970s Japanese approach to compact work vehicles. Lightweight, economical, and mechanically simple, it was designed to be affordable, easy to maintain, and capable of handling light cargo. For farmers, small business owners, and tradespeople, it offered just enough utility to carry tools, produce, or small deliveries without the cost and fuel consumption of larger pickups. Its cab-forward design and tiny footprint made it exceptionally maneuverable in crowded urban streets and narrow rural roads. In many markets, it was praised for these very qualities, and its reliability earned it a loyal following among those who appreciated low-cost, practical transport. Yet the very characteristics that made it appealing in slow or moderate speed environments became liabilities in high-speed contexts. The Forte's chassis was extremely light, and the suspension, while adequate for rural roads or city streets, could not absorb the stresses of fast highway travel. Coupled with a narrow track and modest brakes, the truck exhibited a tendency to become unstable when speeds rose above what would be considered ordinary for its design. Slight steering corrections could provoke oscillations, sudden lane changes could result in fishtailing, and emergency maneuvers could easily overwhelm the limited suspension geometry. Drivers reported that the vehicle felt twitchy at highway speeds, with the rear end prone to stepping out unexpectedly. Combined with the weak braking system, which struggled to provide confident stopping distances under full load, the pickup became increasingly dangerous the faster it traveled. European safety authorities were quick to notice these patterns, especially as Japanese exports expanded into markets with extensive high-speed expressways and long intercity routes. Road tests conducted under local standards revealed instability that would have been unlikely to manifest on short rural roads in Japan. In several countries, regulators refused safety certification for highway or primary road use. The trucks could be registered and driven legally, but only on lower speed, rural, or local roads. Essentially, in practical terms, this limited their use to environments that matched their original design intent. For drivers needing to travel between cities or along fast motorways, the Forte was considered unsafe, and in effect, it was banned from the type of roads most commercial fleets and intercity transport relied upon. Owners often found themselves adapting to these restrictions in creative ways. Some loaded the trucks minimally to reduce rear sway, others avoided high-speed highways entirely, and some modified suspension components to increase stability, though such modifications could never fully overcome the fundamental geometry of the vehicle.
Despite these limitations, the Forte remained popular among those whose usage patterns matched its design strengths: slow rural travel, urban deliveries, and light-duty hauling. Its simplicity, economy, and small size kept it in demand, but its reputation as a delicate, speed-sensitive vehicle persisted. The Mitsubishi Forte/Colt pickup illustrates the risks inherent in exporting a vehicle designed for low-speed, light-duty contexts into markets with higher speed infrastructure and different regulatory expectations. While perfectly adequate for local roads, the truck's light construction, narrow stance, and modest braking system made it effectively unsuitable for highways, prompting authorities to restrict its use. It serves as a historical example of how mechanical design and real-world operating conditions can collide, leaving a seemingly harmless vehicle sidelined in certain markets. Despite these limitations, the Forte's enduring simplicity, affordability, and functionality kept it in demand, but its reputation as a delicate, speed-sensitive vehicle persisted. The story of the Forte reminds us that a vehicle's safety is inseparable from the environment in which it operates. In countries with slower roads and lighter traffic, the pickup thrived. In faster, more demanding environments, it was a warning that compactness, lightness, and low-cost design can carry hidden hazards when stretched beyond their intended context. Even today, surviving examples are valued for their economy and reliability, but those who drove them on faster roads often remember the uneasy awareness that at higher speeds, the truck could behave unpredictably, demanding full attention and respect.
The Ford Bronco II, sold from 1984 to 1990, occupies a dark and uncomfortable place in automotive history. Not because it was slow, ugly, or unreliable, but because its basic proportions and engineering created a vehicle that seemed almost designed to betray its drivers at the worst possible moment. On the showroom floor, the Bronco II looked like exactly what American buyers wanted in the mid-1980s. It was compact, rugged, shaped like a scaled-down off-road truck, and promised real SUV capability without the size and cost of a full-size Bronco. Built on the Ford Ranger platform, it seemed like the perfect compromise: light enough for commuters, tough enough for weekend adventure, practical enough for families. Dealers sold it as a vehicle that could do everything: tow, haul, commute, explore, while still fitting neatly in the garage. But underneath the marketing, the Bronco II carried a design problem that would haunt it forever. The vehicle sat high and narrow, with much of its weight perched above the frame. That combination created an unusually high center of gravity relative to its track width. In normal, gentle driving, it felt fine, even pleasant, thanks to the soft suspension. But when something unexpected happened, a sudden swerve, an emergency lane change, a correction on the highway, or even a quick turn taken just a little too fast, the Bronco II behaved differently from what most drivers expected. Instead of leaning and recovering, it could snap. In many incidents reported across North America and beyond, the rear lifted, the body shifted violently, and the SUV tipped, sometimes rolling once, sometimes multiple times. Drivers had almost no warning and very little chance to correct. What made things worse was that most owners weren't reckless thrill seekers. Many were ordinary families, commuters, and cautious drivers who simply reacted instinctively to unexpected situations: an animal in the road, debris, a drifting car beside them, and found themselves upside down in seconds. As reports accumulated, patterns became impossible to ignore. Insurance companies flagged the Bronco II. Highway patrol officers noticed that rollovers involving the model were disproportionately severe. Internal and external investigations linked the design geometry directly to instability. Lawsuits mounted, testimony accumulated, and engineers dissected what had gone wrong. The stories were remarkably similar. A quick correction, a lane change, a curve taken slightly too fast, and then chaos.
Over the years, dozens upon dozens of rollover fatalities were documented in the United States alone, with far more injuries tied to ejections, roof collapses, and violent tumbling crashes. News organizations investigated, safety advocates pushed regulators, lawyers confronted Ford, families demanded answers. Governments and regulatory bodies began responding in different ways. Some regions issued warnings about rollover risk. Others placed restrictions or imposed testing requirements that made the Bronco II far harder to certify. Fleet purchasers backed away. Certain countries hesitated to approve imports at all, and in places where it technically remained legal, liability concerns made dealers reluctant to continue promoting it. The Bronco II was never always dramatically banned in headline-grabbing fashion, but in practice it became a vehicle that regulators, insurers, and governments increasingly wanted off their roads. Quietly, approvals dried up, sales dropped, its reputation darkened. By the late 1980s, the Bronco II had become a symbol, a cautionary emblem of what happens when marketing ambition collides with marginal stability. It was effectively replaced by the Ford Explorer, which itself would later become part of another major safety controversy. But in the Bronco II's case, the message was already clear. Geometry matters, and physics cannot be negotiated with brochures and slogans. Looking back, the Bronco II's legacy is grim and complicated. On one hand, enthusiasts still admire its compact size, simplicity, and old-school SUV charm. Off-road hobbyists sometimes appreciate its light weight and short wheelbase. Collectors value it as a relic from a formative period in SUV history. But that nostalgia is tempered by harsh reality. The Bronco II helped fuel new scrutiny of rollover risk, vehicle stability standards, tire selection, suspension tuning, and the way manufacturers evaluate emergency handling behavior. It demonstrated brutally and repeatedly that a mass-market vehicle must be designed for imperfect drivers in imperfect situations, not just idealized test scenarios. In the end, the Bronco II's fate wasn't sealed by lack of power, bad styling, or poor sales. It was sealed by fear, lawsuits, injuries, and physics. Its reputation for rolling over didn't merely stick, it defined the vehicle. And in many places, it became banned in practice, quietly removed from approval lists, sidelined by regulators, shunned by insurers, and overshadowed by safer successors. If you'd like, I can go even deeper, including real court cases, engineering memos, crash statistics, how Ford responded internally, and where specifically the Bronco II faced restrictions.
The Chevrolet S10 was one of the most popular compact pickups of the 1980s and 1990s, widely admired for its simplicity, reliability, and versatility. Its lightweight frame, manageable size, and responsive handling made it a favorite among small business owners, contractors, and suburban drivers who needed a capable yet economical work truck. Yet the very qualities that made it appealing, its compact dimensions and light weight, also meant it had a relatively high center of gravity once modified. During this era, a booming aftermarket culture encouraged owners to install oversized lift kits, often paired with huge off-road tires, to give the S10 the appearance and capability of a full-size off-road truck. What many enthusiasts did not realize, however, was that these modifications dramatically altered the truck's original stability characteristics. The stock S10 was designed with a particular balance between suspension travel, tire width, and chassis stiffness. When lift kits raised the suspension several inches, the truck's center of gravity increased significantly. Coupled with large, heavy tires that could shift weight unpredictably, this made the pickup prone to fishtailing, tipping, and complete rollovers during maneuvers that would have been perfectly safe in stock form. Even moderate-speed cornering became hazardous, and emergency lane changes could provoke violent body roll.
Owners often reported that the truck felt nervous or top-heavy after modifications, and some admitted that everyday driving now required constant vigilance, especially when the bed was loaded or on uneven terrain. Accident reports began accumulating in several regions. Highway safety authorities noticed that lifted S10s were disproportionately represented in rollover incidents, particularly in suburban and rural areas with faster roads. Investigations revealed a consistent cause. The altered center of gravity made sudden maneuvers or steering corrections far more dangerous than anticipated. While stock S10s continued to operate safely, these heavily modified versions were directly linked to crashes, some of which resulted in serious injuries or fatalities. In response, regulators took decisive action. Certain U.S. states and some international jurisdictions implemented restrictions that effectively banned these lifted variants from highways, municipal fleets, and other controlled public road use. Inspections and vehicle registration processes were amended to flag extreme lift modifications as unsafe, and authorities instructed owners to remove or reduce lift heights if they wanted to maintain road legality. In practice, this meant that while the Chevrolet S10 itself was not universally prohibited, any unit with a massive aftermarket lift and oversized tires could no longer legally travel on roads where speed and stability were essential. Some fleets replaced or retrofitted modified S10s, and insurance companies often refused coverage or applied higher premiums to vehicles with extreme lifts. Owners responded in various ways. Some reverted their trucks to stock suspension setups to comply with new regulations, while others confined lifted trucks to private property, off-road tracks, or rural backroads where the risk of an accident was lower. Enthusiast communities debated the balance between performance and safety, with older drivers and mechanics often warning newcomers about the dangers of raising a small pickup beyond its original design limits. Videos and photographs of S10 rollovers circulated in newsletters and forums, reinforcing the reputation of lifted variants as unstable and dangerous. The S10 lift kit phenomenon highlights the broader lesson of how aftermarket modifications can transform a safe, well-designed vehicle into a liability. The stock truck, compact and reliable, had been perfectly engineered for stability within its intended operating envelope. The lifted versions, however, ignored fundamental principles of vehicle dynamics, resulting in trucks that were fast, aggressive in appearance, but inherently unstable. Regulators, insurers, and road safety advocates treated these trucks as effectively banned in regions where the risks were unacceptable. Even decades later, the story of the lifted S10 remains a cautionary tale. It illustrates that even the most dependable vehicles can become dangerous when altered beyond their original engineering limits. Enthusiasts still admire lifted S10s for off-road performance and style, but the memory of rollovers, restrictions, and legal bans serves as a reminder that stability, center of gravity, and proper suspension geometry are not optional. The S10 lift crisis of the 1980s and 1990s remains an enduring example of how a seemingly simple modification can create a class of vehicles that regulators, insurers, and road safety advocates are compelled to restrict or prohibit entirely.
The Nissan D21 hardbody of the 1980s is remembered today as a remarkably durable and capable compact pickup. A vehicle that combines simplicity, lightweight, and practical utility in a way few other trucks of its era managed. It was exported globally, carrying the reputation of Japanese engineering reliability to farms, construction sites, and suburban driveways alike. Farmers valued it for its nimbleness on rural roads and its ability to haul moderate loads with minimal fuel consumption. Small business owners appreciated that it could serve as both a delivery vehicle and a personal utility truck. Mechanics admired the straightforward engine and drivetrain, which were easy to maintain, and drivers loved its efficiency and general toughness. At first glance, the D21 seemed almost unassailable, a truck that could work hard, last long, and demand little in return. Yet beneath that durable exterior, early models carried a critical and hidden flaw, one that would influence regulations, safety certifications, and driver experience in several countries. The root of the problem lay in the combination of the suspension and steering design. The D21 was engineered for moderate speeds, carrying reasonable loads across city streets, dirt roads, and rural routes. Its leaf spring rear suspension, relatively narrow track width, and lightweight chassis worked well in those intended conditions. But when pushed onto faster highways and interstates, the geometry revealed an unsettling characteristic: sudden, unpredictable instability at speed. A driver performing an abrupt lane change to avoid an obstacle or reacting to traffic could experience a sharp lateral snap from the rear of the truck. It was not a gradual sway or manageable body roll. It was an almost instantaneous shift of the rear end, as if the truck had decided independently to pivot sideways. The effect was terrifying to drivers who expected the predictable handling of a small pickup. At interstate speeds, the difference between safe and dangerous maneuvers could be a fraction of a second. In certain conditions, fully loaded bed, high ambient temperatures, or crosswinds, the truck could quickly overcorrect, fishtail, or even roll. Authorities in multiple regions took note. In countries with high-speed freeways, safety regulators conducted formal tests on the early hardbody pickups. Emergency lane change simulations, slalom courses, and load-bearing evaluations highlighted a consistent pattern of risk. The truck's rear suspension and steering geometry did not provide enough stability margin to accommodate sudden evasive maneuvers at speed. Unlike stock performance concerns in other vehicles, these D21 pickups exhibited a sharp, sudden transition from stable to unstable, leaving almost no reaction window for the driver. As a result, in several jurisdictions, authorities refused highway safety certification for the early hardbody models. Registration was limited to local or rural roads where speeds were lower and the truck's handling could remain predictable. In practical terms, this effectively banned these trucks from primary roads and freeways until the handling issues could be corrected in subsequent production runs. Drivers and fleet operators learned the limitations of the early hardbody quickly. Owners adapted by avoiding interstate travel when possible, maintaining lighter loads, and exercising extreme caution during lane changes or passing maneuvers. Fleet operators sometimes excluded early D21s from routes requiring high-speed highway travel, recognizing the liability posed by their instability. Mechanics who worked on these trucks observed the same pattern repeatedly, noting that minor adjustments, tire pressure, suspension bushings, or load distribution could mitigate but never fully eliminate the risk. Videos and accident reports from the era circulated among enthusiasts and safety investigators alike, reinforcing the perception that the early D21, while mechanically dependable, carried a hidden hazard under certain conditions. Nissan responded in later models with significant suspension revisions. Steering ratios were adjusted, rear suspension geometry was modified, and structural reinforcements were added to improve high-speed stability. These engineering updates allowed subsequent hardbody pickups to pass highway safety certifications in markets where the earliest trucks had been restricted. The improvements transformed the vehicle from a high-speed hazard into a capable, reliable, and globally respected compact pickup. Yet the legacy of the early D21 remained, a cautionary chapter in which a mechanically sound, durable vehicle could exhibit dangerous behavior when its intended operating envelope was exceeded. The D21 hardbody story serves as a vivid example of how small design decisions, suspension geometry, track width, steering response, can have dramatic consequences when vehicles are used in environments that exceed the original design parameters. It illustrates the interplay between engineering, driver behavior, and regulatory oversight, highlighting the necessity of testing vehicles not only for mechanical reliability, but for dynamic handling under real-world conditions. Surviving early hard-body trucks are still admired by collectors and enthusiasts for their ruggedness, simplicity, and longevity. But those familiar with their quirks recall the unnerving awareness that at higher interstate speeds, a sudden lane change could transform a dependable utility truck into a vehicle that demanded full respect and extreme caution. Even decades later, the early D21 hardbody is remembered not merely as a capable pickup, but as a vehicle whose hidden handling challenges influenced regulatory decisions, driver habits, and the evolution of compact pickup engineering. It reminds the automotive world that durability alone does not equate to safety, and that even the sturdiest, most reliable vehicles can harbor vulnerabilities that emerge only when pushed beyond their intended limits.
The International Harvester Scout II, produced between 1971 and 1980, is often remembered as one of America's earliest sport utility vehicles, a rugged off-road machine that blended pickup practicality with adventurous styling. Its versatility made it a favorite among farmers, construction workers, outdoor enthusiasts, and even small business owners who valued its cargo capacity, four-wheel drive capability, and relatively compact size for a full-size utility vehicle. Yet while it thrived in the United States and other markets with forgiving road conditions, its design had serious shortcomings when exposed to stricter safety standards abroad, particularly in parts of Europe and Asia. The Scout II was built with off-road durability in mind. Its frame was strong, the suspension capable of handling rough terrain, and the drivetrain resilient. But its cabin offered minimal rollover protection, and the body structure provided little energy absorption in side impacts. Crash tests conducted in several countries revealed that in collisions where other compact or mid-size pickups could protect occupants to some degree, the Scout II's cabin structure collapsed easily, leaving passengers vulnerable to severe injury. Side impact crashes were particularly alarming. The doors could buckle, the pillars twist, and in some cases the interior space was reduced so severely that survival rates were alarmingly low. Occupants were at high risk of head, chest, and limb injuries even at moderate speeds. Regulators in these markets acted quickly. In nations with strict highway safety rules, authorities refused to grant full registration for certain heavy-duty Scout pickup variants. Vehicles could not be legally driven on high-speed roads or intercity highways until design modifications addressed the structural weaknesses. Some countries allowed only lighter, lower-powered, or strictly civilian-use models, while commercial or heavily loaded variants were outright banned from highways. Importers who had hoped to sell fleets of these Scouts had to withdraw units, issue warnings to buyers, or retrofit safety features to comply with local standards. These restrictions were often quietly enforced, leaving many drivers unaware of the specific hazards until crash data or regulatory communications surfaced. Owners and enthusiasts recall the Scout II's remarkable capability off-road, but also the unnerving awareness that its cabin offered minimal protection compared with competitors. In markets with rigorous safety testing, anecdotal reports suggested that the truck could withstand mud, gravel, and rocky terrain far better than a paved road collision at even moderate speed. The very qualities that made it a rugged adventurer, lightweight doors, minimalistic interior, and a body-on-frame design focused on off-road resilience rather than crash safety, were the same qualities that put occupants at grave risk on highways. Fleet operators and transport authorities, confronted with mounting evidence from side impact and rollover tests, concluded that the trucks simply could not meet local safety expectations without redesign. International Harvester eventually responded with minor reinforcements to the cabin structure, door latching mechanisms, and, in some regions, the addition of optional roll bars and other protective elements. These changes allowed some later variants to meet regulatory requirements, but the early heavy-duty pickups remained restricted in markets with stringent highway safety standards. For drivers in countries where registration was denied, the Scout II became a vehicle constrained to low-speed, local use, often relegated to farms, construction sites, or private off-road tracks. The story of the Scout II pickup underscores a crucial lesson in automotive safety and international regulations. A vehicle that performs admirably in its intended environment can fail dramatically when assessed under different conditions or higher-speed road networks. While the Scout II gained a legendary status in the United States for ruggedness, reliability, and off-road prowess, in parts of Europe and Asia, it was recognized as a dangerous vehicle for highway travel due to poor occupant protection in side impacts and limited rollover resistance. Even today, collectors admire the Scout II for its pioneering design and off-road capability, but the historical regulatory bans serve as a reminder that safety standards vary globally, and that a truck's toughness off-road does not automatically translate to safety on paved highways. The International Harvester Scout II remains both an icon of adventure and a cautionary tale about how structural limitations can restrict a vehicle's legal and practical use across different markets.
The Dodge D-Series pickups of the 1970s were widely regarded as durable, capable, and emblematic of American work trucks. Farmers, tradespeople, and industrial operators relied on them for heavy-duty hauling, towing, and general utility. The standard trucks were robust, with a low enough center of gravity to remain stable even under full loads. They could navigate unpaved roads, construction sites, and rural routes with ease, and their straightforward mechanical design made them relatively simple to maintain. Yet in an era when off-road capability became a selling point, Dodge began offering factory-installed lift and off-road suspension packages on certain D-Series models. These tall variants promised better clearance, improved articulation over rough terrain, and a more commanding presence on the road. What they also brought, however, was a hidden danger that would limit their use in multiple international markets. By raising the suspension, these factory packages significantly increased the truck's center of gravity. While the modifications were beneficial for low-speed off-road driving, they compromised high-speed stability on paved roads. Drivers reported that cornering felt precarious, with body roll far exceeding that of standard trucks. Sudden evasive maneuvers could provoke tipping or near rollover situations, and fully loaded beds exacerbated the problem. Independent testing in several countries confirmed what owners had feared. The lifted trucks were far more prone to instability in highway and urban driving scenarios than conventional D-Series pickups. At moderate speeds, the tall variants behaved unpredictably during lane changes or tight turns, and the risk of a rollover was unacceptably high by local regulatory standards. Authorities responded decisively. In several European, Asian, and Latin American nations, regulators refused safety certification for the factory-lifted trucks on public highways. While standard D-Series pickups could be registered without issue, the taller off-road variants were effectively banned from everyday road use in numerous countries. Fleet regulations were particularly strict. Government and corporate fleets were prohibited from operating these trucks unless the suspension upgrades were removed or otherwise modified to restore stability. In practice, this meant that many owners had to either reverse the factory-installed lift kits or restrict the truck's operation to private property, farms, and off-road trails, where the heightened center of gravity posed less risk. Dealers and importers had to comply with these regulations, sometimes retrofitting returned vehicles or refusing to sell lifted variants in restricted markets. The truck's reputation in these regions became a mix of admiration and caution. Drivers recognized the lifted D-Series as highly capable off-road and visually impressive, but they also understood that the same characteristics that made it formidable on rough terrain rendered it hazardous on normal roads.
Insurance companies often imposed higher premiums or coverage restrictions for these tall variants, reflecting the documented risk of rollover accidents. Accident reports in some areas reinforced the danger. Trucks rolling during what would have been routine turns, or tipping in emergency maneuvers that would have been handled safely by standard models. Dodge eventually addressed some of these issues with later designs, revising suspension geometry, widening track widths, and enhancing sway control to improve on-road stability. Yet the early factory-lifted D-Series pickups remained notorious for a period in which regulatory authorities effectively treated them as unroadworthy, enforcing bans and restrictions to prevent accidents. This chapter in the truck's history illustrates the delicate balance between off-road capability, center of gravity management, and public road safety. Even factory-engineered modifications that improve performance in one domain can create significant hazards in another, leading to legal restrictions and practical limitations. Today, collectors and enthusiasts appreciate these lifted D-Series pickups for their rugged styling and off-road potential, but historical accounts from regulators and fleets serve as a reminder that a truck's engineering envelope is finite. The factory off-road packages of the 1970s demonstrated how a capable vehicle can become hazardous when its balance is altered, and how authorities worldwide had to intervene to prevent these visually impressive but inherently unstable trucks from endangering drivers on public highways. In essence, the tall D-Series pickups were celebrated off-road warriors and simultaneously treated as banned machines for everyday road use in numerous countries, highlighting the tension between capability, safety, and regulation that continues to influence vehicle design today.